Hello everybody and welcome to another Vintage Fans and More how-to video. Today I'm doing a video that I've been promising for quite some time. I'm going to show you how to convert an IntelliTouch Casablanca fan to a 3-speed pull chain fan. While I'm going to be demonstrating on an IntelliTouch fan, this conversion works for any Casablanca fan utilizing the Emerson K55 motor, Samsung, Astrosyn, or XLP motors. All of those motors are basically configured the same way, so this is a conversion that will work for almost all of Casablanca's control systems, whether it be IntelliTouch, ComfortTouch, AdvanTouch, Slumber Quiet, Slumber 5, Cardboard Box, Variable Speed, or even if the board on a 3 or 4 speed pull chain fan goes bad on you for some reason. Now this conversion does require a pull chain control, so it's going to be most useful on fans that have a dedicated switch housing like the Panama here. If you're looking for a fix for a model like the Stealth, Venus, or even Mission for example, I have a single speed conversion that's more conducive to that type of fan, so I will link that somewhere in this video or in the description below. Before starting, I always have to give the disclaimer that this conversion will void any and all warranty with Casablanca Fan Company. They will not support this product after you've tampered with it. So it's not a bad idea to watch this video through, make sure you have everything you need, and that you understand how everything works before you tear your fan apart. This conversion is basically building off the single speed conversion that I posted before. It can get a little bit messy as you start factoring in the pull chain and extra capacitors. I will do my best to explain it and provide you with any and all information that I can. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and I will try my best to clarify for you. I will just say there are multiple ways that you can do this conversion. Everybody has their own preference. I'm just going to show you the way I do it. What I try to achieve is the most universal conversion that I possibly can. I've chosen capacitor values that produce speeds that are hopefully universally pleasing for almost everybody, and I put in all of the typical wiring and components so that any future user of the fan will have everything they need right in place, and will be able to figure out how it all functions. So with all that being said, we're ready to get started. Heading into the parts and supplies, you'll need a 10 microfarad capacitor similar to what's shown. Also a multi-value capacitor with both 5 microfarads and 7 microfarads, any other values don't matter, and also a single 5 microfarad capacitor. The capacitors that I use have greatly been influenced by what's readily available on eBay. I've been able to pretty consistently be able to find capacitors like these, so I've been sticking with it for almost all of my conversions, and for your benefit it keeps the amount of capacitors you need to a relative minimum. You also need a 2-position switch to implement the reverse feature. It can be 3-wire from the start or 6-wire as shown here. The 6-wire seems to be a little bit more readily available. If your fan already utilizes a physical reverse switch like this, it should be the variety you need and you can recycle it and reuse it in this conversion. If at all possible, avoid the all-plastic units as shown here. If that's all you have, it'll work fine, but the thickness of the plastic makes it more difficult to lay out the holes for mounting, so you'd have to pull out a ruler or measuring tape to help you there. You'll see why the thin metal ones are easier to work with later on in the video. Avoid switches like this with loops and multiple wires going to one position. They can be made to function, but it's just a lot of unnecessary work. You also need a 3-speed, 4-position pull chain. Not all pull chain units are created equal. You need to make sure you have a pull chain that controls each output separately. Otherwise, the correct speeds will not be produced. Look for units that indicate L1, L2, L3 combinations. If there's any indication of L1 plus 2 or L2 plus 3, that pull chain will not work. Oftentimes there is no indication. If in the end your fan does not seem to be producing the right speeds, you can swap out and try a different type of pull chain. You'll also need wire. 18 gauge stranded is usually a safe bet. You need at least black and white. I like to also have blue and red because it helps differentiate each wire's function, but both colors can be substituted with black. You need enough black, white, and blue to make it up the entire length of your fan's downrod, plus a little extra. I've never really measured how much extra I need. I'd say at least 3 to 5 feet to be safe. You only need a few feet of the red. 3 feet would probably do it. If you do not have a light kit and don't ever plan to add one, you can omit the blue. I, however, always put it in the case that one may be added in the future. As far as tools go, you're going to need a drill and an assortment of drill bits. You'll also need a variety of tools to disassemble your fan. That's going to vary by age and model of the fan, but flat and Phillips head screwdrivers, as well as a socket or nut driver set, will be a good place to start. You should also have a wire stripper. You'll need an assortment of wire nuts. I prefer the small gray ones when wiring inside the motor housing. They're a neutral color, so they usually don't show through the vent screens, but you can choose any wire nuts of appropriate size. It's also greatly beneficial to have zip ties. If you don't have an assortment like this and are just picking up a pack, bigger is better. Other helpful things to have, but not so much required, are an ultra-fine point Sharpie, some form of utility or X-Acto knife, a large paper clip that you can sacrifice to bend as shown, and electrical tape. A set of needle nose pliers may also prove beneficial. I'm going to start with disassembling down to the bare motor. This process will of course vary based on the age and model of your fan. I am starting by removing the downrod and motor coupler. If Loctite is preventing your downrod from unscrewing, or your fan uses the stub downrod that mounts directly to the motor, you can remove everything at once by unscrewing the 3 bolts in the motor. I've done this a number of times so I know where each and every part goes on these fans. If you think you'll have problems remembering where everything goes, it's not a bad idea to pull out your phone and take pictures as you go, or somehow label the parts or lay them out in order so that you remember where everything goes at the end. Next, I'm going to remove the motor housing. The structure of the housing and method of removal varies from fan to fan, but you need to get it down to the bare motor, which looks very much the same inside of every fan. At this point, you also want to remove the switch cap or light kit if you haven't already. I probably should have done this step first, since in some cases you have to remove the light kit before you remove the housing. With everything opened up, you're ready to start tearing down the existing control system. Depending on your fan's original control system, there may be a variety of components mounted to the side of the motor or down in the switch housing. We want to remove essentially all of the existing components. The one exception is, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a reverse switch already mounted in the switch housing, you can leave that in place but remove any connectors attached to the wires. You just want the remaining switch with 3 loose wires. You can see here I am removing the circuit board and pulling the wires out of the connectors. This is a more typical process with IntelliTouch, Advantouch, or Comfort Touch fans. If your fan utilizes the orange stick-on BFR strip, you can simply peel that off. In some fans, there is a lot of excess wiring that needs to be removed. Basically, what you need to get it down to is, based on the age of the fan, either 3 or 4 wires coming directly out of the motor. There will be a brown, a red that sometimes appears a little bit pink, and either 1 or 2 whites. Older fans are more likely to have 2 whites, newer fans will only have 1. Essentially, everything that you remove can be discarded. There's not really anything in any of the wiring or electrical components that can be reused. Do take note that if you're converting a system like IntelliTouch that uses a control at the wall or even a handheld control, that previous control is going to be essentially useless with this fan after the conversion. Pop that old control on eBay, somebody's probably going to pick it up for parts, but I mainly wanted to advise you, if you have a wall control location, you can replace the old control with a simple on-off switch and run the fan by the pull chain. Or you can install any type of basic fan control, or even another type of remote control following another tutorial video that I will link for you somewhere in this video or down below in the description. As you're removing wiring, work gently and pay attention to what you're doing. You don't want to yank the wires you need left behind right out of the motor. Here you can see I have my red, brown, and on this particular fan, 2 whites. If you are converting a fan that utilized a pull chain previously, these wires will be down in the switch housing. I am going to start by making the modifications necessary to mount the pull chain and reverse switch. If your fan already utilizes a pull chain based system with reverse switch, Slumber Quiet or Slumber 5 would be good examples. You can skip this step. Your fan already has all the necessary openings. When you lay out the placement for the pull chain, you want to peek inside the switch housing and make sure you're not going to drill through any of the thick castings. It doesn't matter a whole lot where you place the pull chain, but typical placement on a Casablanca fan is approximately 90 degrees off the center of the information tag, to the right of the tag if you're looking at it as if it were hanging on the ceiling. Sometimes the thicker parts of the casting don't allow for that exact placement. If that's the case, just get it as close as possible. The placement should also be about halfway between the top and bottom of the flat part of the switch housing. Once I've got my placement, I start with a very small drill bit to prevent it walking all over the place and ruining the finish. From there, I gradually work my way up to approximately 1/8 inch. As you approach that 1/8 inch size, you may want to test fit the pull chain as you go. Some brands of pull chains will work with a size smaller, certain ones need a size larger, so it's best to test fit your specific unit to ensure that you don't go too large. I kind of sped through here and didn't show every single size that I drilled. I try to move up only a couple sizes at a time at maximum. It allows you better control and the holes drill much cleaner. If you have a light kit that does not contain an integrated pull chain control and need to mount one in the switch housing, you can drill an additional hole opposite the one you just drilled. Typical genuine Casablanca light kits will not have an integrated control. A simple on-off pull chain can be found at any of the big box stores or online and can be used to serve this function. With the switch housing done, we can move to the upper housing plate. Again, if your reverse switch is already in the switch housing, you do not need to do this step. Begin by finding a place on your specific fan where the reverse switch will fit. If your top housing is completely solid with no venting, my recommendations would be either to drill some holes to accommodate it, or if you're not concerned with the reverse function, you can tuck the switch away inside of the motor housing, making sure it's bundled up with the other wiring and won't get caught up in the motor rotation. You could also attempt to put it in a lower motor vent. That usually doesn't look as clean. If you don't want to drill it all, but you do want access to the reverse function, you could reconfigure this setup so that all of the wiring is down in the switch housing where the reverse switch could be accessed by removing the cap or light kit. Just a few pro tip ideas there. It is difficult to give instructions that will work with every single fan. Continuing with my fan, I'm going to cut away a bit of the vent screen material in the area where I want to mount my switch. You want to clear enough away so that you'll be able to mark the holes for the reverse switch. Some of the vent screen materials Casablanca used are very fragile, so just be a little bit careful so you don't lose more than you intended. It is then just a matter of sticking in the reverse switch and marking the holes. Ensure the switch has room to operate freely and correctly. This is where the thin metal switch as opposed to the thick plastic type of switch comes in handy. You can just stick a fine tip marker right through the holes. No measuring or further layout necessary. After you've got your markings, you can drill. Again, starting small. Most reverse switch screws are pretty small, so you won't have to work up too far in size. If there are any little burrs remaining after drilling, you can pick them off with a needle nose pliers or even clean them up with a small file if you have one. You just want it mostly clean, it doesn't have to be pristine. With the other modifications done, we are ready to move on to the wiring. I do want to pause here and address that if you are converting a fan that was previously controlled by a pull chain, you are going to be completing all of this wiring down in the switch housing. There will be certain aspects that you can kind of cut out. I will try to explain some of those as we go along, but moving back to my fan here, I'm starting with the brown, red, and the longer of the two whites coming out the side of the motor. If those wires are coming out of the top of the motor for you, you simply fish them down through and out one of the side vents. If you only have one white wire, it should be coming out the side with the brown and the red. I'm starting by just getting those wires prepared and stripping them back a little bit. Next, I'm picking up my reverse switch. You can see I've broken off the wire leads on one side. If your switch only had 3 leads to start, you're good to go. If it had 6 like mine, simply twist the 3 back and forth until they break off. It doesn't matter which side you pick as long as all 3 are in a row. I'm also grabbing my 10 microfarad capacitor. If you're familiar with my single speed conversion, what we're about to do is very similar. Take one lead from the reverse switch on either side, as in not the middle wire. Pair it with either of the two leads from the 10 microfarad capacitor, and pair both of those together with either the red or the brown wire. It does not matter what combination of wires those are, as long as it's one from the capacitor, one from either side of the reverse switch, and either the red or brown from the motor. Secure that connection with a wire nut. Now we're going to go back and basically repeat that process again with the remaining wires. Take the remaining wire from the reverse switch, again not the center wire, pair it with the remaining lead from the capacitor, and either the red or the brown from the motor, whatever you have left. As I secure that connection, I will do a little recap. The brown and the red from the motor should not be under the same connection, and the center wire on the reverse switch should not be used for anything yet, nor should the white from the motor. I am trying to hold it a little bit here so that you can see and check your work, but it is a bit difficult to show on camera. What I'm going to do now is take my odd color, again you can substitute black for this, and I'm going to feed it through the top and out the same side vent as the other wires. Strip it back, and then this is the singular wire that pairs with the previously unused middle wire on the reverse switch. Again, secure that connection with a wire nut. I'm going to pause here to refer back to if you're doing the wiring in the switch housing. If you're converting a fan with the reverse switch already down in the switch housing, you do not need to implement this red wire. Its purpose is basically just to extend the reverse switch down into the switch housing. So basically you can just leave the middle wire on the reverse switch unattached for now. Later on, I'm going to direct you to connect certain wiring to this red wire in the switch housing. At that time, instead of connecting that wiring to the red wire, it should be directly connected to the middle wire of the reverse switch. Now I'm going to jump back into the tutorial for my specific fan. Next, I'm just measuring out a length that will get me down into the switch housing. Cut it off there. I always go a little bit long. I'd rather have too much than not enough. And then you feed that free end down the shaft right into the switch housing. Pull the wire down until it's taut but not stretched or strained. Next, I'm grabbing my white wire. And once again, I'm going to feed that from the top down out the same side vent as all the other wiring. I am stripping back my new white wire and simply splicing it onto the existing white wire from the motor, of course securing it with a wire nut. And then once again just measuring out another length to get down to the switch housing, just like the red wire before. Again, cut it off and feed it down the shaft in the exact same fashion. Now I'm going to pause here and give some additional instruction. I mentioned earlier if you only have one white wire, it should be coming out the side of the motor. What you're going to do in that case is splice on a white and feed it down to the switch housing just as I showed you. The additional step you have to do is splice on another white and feed it back out the top of the motor. This wire has to be long enough to make it up the entire length of your downrod, plus a little extra to allow for wiring. Essentially what you need is a neutral at the ceiling and inside the switch housing. However you achieve that is really up to you. If you need a better visual representation of what I'm talking about, I did a single speed conversion on a motor that utilized only one white wire. I will try to remember to link that somewhere, and you can fast forward through and look for that part of the video to see what I do. If your motor has two white wires, this information is irrelevant to you and you can continue watching and following this tutorial exactly. Now I'm going to set the motor upright in preparation for putting the motor housing top plate back on. Go ahead and set it in place. Make sure you're not pinching any wires between the motor and the housing. You can refasten it in place with the correct hardware. Before you fasten it down, make sure that the reverse switch will reach the location that you've marked out and drilled for it. Otherwise, you should be good to go. Now we're going to get the reverse switch placed and fastened in. I did neglect to mention earlier that the screws included with the reverse switch may not be long enough to fasten it. Sometimes they're long enough, but usually not. It's easy enough to get some screws at the hardware store. A bit of an inconvenience, but certainly more cost-effective than a new fan. I just like to make sure the switch is fitting okay and that it functions. Then we are ready to get to fastening everything else inside the housing. I typically use zip ties to fasten the capacitor to the upper plate or the motor itself. On many fans they'll just poke through the vent screens. On some fans you may have to cut to allow for them to pass through, but it's a quick and easy, pretty clean way to get things done. I will also use zip ties to bundle up excess of wire if there is any. You could also use electrical tape if you prefer. Regardless, you need to make sure nothing is too loose or able to flop around inside. If it gets caught up in the motor rotation, you're going to have a mess. I do also make sure to trim off any excess zip tie to make sure it doesn't get caught up in the motor rotation as well. I didn't have to do a huge amount of fastening on this particular fan, but I have had fans in the past that I've had to do quite a bit in to make sure that it's secure. Once that's all wrapped up, we're ready to move back to some wiring. So here I'm just going to go ahead and run out some length of both my black and blue wires. Again, if your fan does not have a light kit, you can choose to omit the blue, but I always put it in anyways. Take both the black and the blue wire and feed them down through the shaft into the switch housing. You'll want at least a few inches down in the switch housing, enough to make comfortable wiring connections. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, if your motor only has one white wire, you will have already spliced on a length to go up the downrod inside the motor housing. If your fan has two whites, as mine does, typically the one left behind coming out the top of the motor is not long enough to make it up the downrod. So you can see I've trimmed it off fairly short and stripped it back, and I'm simply going to splice on a new white wire that will make it all the way up the downrod. You could use wire splices to make this connection if you have them on hand. I always just use one of my small gray wire nuts. They nestle down right under the downrod to motor coupler, so it's not visible and you never know the difference. So with that spliced on, I'm just going to hold my wires out and select a length to cut them at. You'll want to cut yours so that there is about 8 inches coming out the top of the downrod length. Now we're going to flip the fan over and go into the switch housing. I am grabbing the white and blue wires that I fed down, and I'm just cutting them off at an equal length with 5 or 6 inches in the switch housing remaining. Since my fan does not use a light kit, I'm just going to cap off both of these wires. If your fan does utilize a light kit, these are the wires that will be the hot and neutral specifically for your light. Then I just tuck them in so they're not out and flopping around in the way of what we're going to do next. Now we're going to go in and start creating the speed and pull chain setup. Grab the multi-value capacitor. If your capacitor has values other than the 5 and 7 required, cap off the wires for the other values. The diagram on the capacitor indicates which value pairs with each color. Some capacitors, like the one I'm using, have dual power inputs. These wires will typically be the same color to indicate as such. We only need one input for this application, so you can cap the second one. It doesn't matter which one you choose to utilize. If your capacitor only has one input, you're already good to go. Cut a short tail of one of your odd color wires, or black, just a few inches long, and then strip it back on one end. Keep that nearby. Grab the red wire coming down into the switch housing and trim it to a reasonable length, and also strip it back. Grab that little tail you cut along with both capacitors. You're going to join the red coming into the switch housing, the little wire tail, one lead from the 5 microfarad capacitor, and the single input wire for the multi-value capacitor. So you should have 4 wires coming out of this connection. Secure it with an appropriately sized wire nut. As I mentioned earlier, if your reverse switch is down in the switch housing, you did not need to implement this red wire. This is where the middle wire of the reverse switch should be directly substituted for the red wire. Here is kind of an overview of where we're at so far. Next, I'm going to strip back the loose end of that little wire tail that we just tied in with the rest. Then you're going to grab the pull chain, and this wire is going into the number 3 position on the chain. Now I'm going to pause here and give you some additional information. If you have means to solder the tips of these wires going into the pull chain, they will push in a lot more easily and be more secure. I realize not everybody has the means or ability to do that, so I didn't do it for this video either. So the main alternate solution that I have is to twist the stranded wires as tightly as you can. If you push them in gently a little bit at a time, they'll usually slip in. If not, you can use the bent paper clip that I suggested you have to kind of help shove them in. Once you think you have them in, tug back gently on the wires to make sure they don't simply pull out again. When you're done, there should not be any excess of bare wire remaining around the pull chain terminals. There also should not be any stray strands of wire sticking out. If your wire gets too splayed out and messy, snip it off, strip back another piece, and try it again. Patience is a virtue on this part, but it is possible. So jumping back into my tutorial, this first wire was giving me a little bit of a problem. You can see I'm using the paper clip to gently coax it in, and then I'm tugging back on it to ensure that it is sticking in place. Inside are essentially little spring tabs. The paper clip is firm enough to kind of push them out of the way and allow the wire to get in place better. So this one is finally complete, and you can see that I basically don't have any bare wire showing around the terminal. So now I'm going to take the black power wire coming into the switch housing, I'm going to trim it to an appropriate length again, and then strip it back. Basically repetition of what we just did with the last wire. And you can see here I'm twisting it up tight once again. Then we're going back to the pull chain, and this wire is going into the L position. And then it's more of the same, gently coaxing the wire in, using the paper clip if necessary, making sure there are no stray wires. With the black wire in place, I'm going back and cutting another tail of my odd color wire, stripping it back on one end, and you're going to take that tail and pair it with the remaining lead from the single 5 microfarad capacitor and the lead for the 7 microfarad value from the multi-value capacitor. Again, the diagram on the multi-value capacitor will tell you which color is the 7 microfarad value. Fasten that connection with an appropriately sized wire nut. Now strip back the remaining end of that little tail that you just tied in with the capacitors. You can see again here that I'm twisting it up tightly, and this wire is going into position number 2 on the pull chain. Return to the multi-value capacitor. At this point you should only have one wire remaining. It should be the remaining 5 microfarad value, and that goes to position number 1 on the pull chain. Since the capacitor tips are often soldered from the factory, this should be the easiest connection to make. Now we're ready to move into really wrapping this up. Unscrew the finial from the pull chain, feed the pull chain through the hole that you drilled, and then replace the finial, tightening it until hand tight. Make sure that none of the wires are getting pinched in any way, and also make sure that all of the wires are still in place and that none have popped out. This is kind of the last chance to check your work as you go. As you tighten the finial down, make sure the switch itself is positioned so that it won't interfere with the switch cap or light kit. Then you really just start kind of bundling everything up and tucking it into the switch housing. I do like to dig the light kit wires that we tucked in earlier out so that they're not buried under a mass of other wiring. So not a bad idea to pull those out and then tuck everything else in with those wires laying on top of everything else at the end. At this point, you basically just put the fan entirely back together. The conversion is complete, it's just reassembly. While reassembling the switch housing and motor housing components, just keep an eye out so that no wires get pinched in the process. When reinstalling the motor to downrod coupler, make sure that wire nut spliced onto the neutral is kind of tucked down into the venting of the motor. Do not push it down inside the motor, just ensure that the coupler is going to sit flush down onto the motor. Ensure that no other wiring is getting pinched in this process. If the coupler is not sitting down flush on the motor, figure out what is obstructing it and resolve that issue before tightening the screws all the way down. Ensure that you retighten all necessary set screws. Strip back the ends of the new lead wires if you haven't already, then your fan is ready to reinstall. With your fan reinstalled, it's ready to provide you with comfort for years to come. I hope you found today's video helpful. Be sure to hit subscribe before you leave and check out my other how-to videos if you need any other fan-related help. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I will see you next time. Click left to view my single-speed Casablanca conversion suited for fans like the Stealth, Venus, and Bel Air, or click right to learn how to mount a remote receiver in the motor housing.